Amanda Anderson, welcome to Tomato Tomato. I'm so excited to have you here today.
I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you. Okay, so please start by introducing yourself. Who are you? What do you do? Where are you at? What brought us together?
Sure. So I'm a professor at Brown, where you are about to graduate.
Oh,
Um, I am a professor of English and humanities. Originally, I was trained in 19th century British literature with an emphasis on intellectual history, the relationship between literature and culture, and a kind of deep and abiding interest in, I would say, cultures of argumentation within the academy. Brown is the third school that I have taught at. I started out at the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, then taught at Hopkins for 13 years, Johns Hopkins for 13 years, where I also served as department chair, and came to Brown in 2012 and have been here. And for most of the time that I've been here, I've been the director of the Kogut Institute for the Humanities, which has been a really rewarding and enriching job. And that's where we met because you were here this year as an undergraduate fellow working on your thesis in company with our fellows from various uh, career levels, including graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, and faculty. Um, in terms of how, I mean, sort of transformations over time in my career, my areas of interest have continued to evolve as they do, I think, with any you know, alert and dynamic scholar. So I would say I study the novel more generally across literary periods, not, simply restricted to the 19th century, primarily in English. And I've been increasingly interested in political theory, psychology, and ethics. And I would say generally that most of my work is what you would call meta-commentary, which is to say, I try to assess and probe trends in the field of literature and the broader humanities and humanistic social sciences. I mean, I do on the ground, granular readings and analyses, but I'm really, really interested in larger trends.
yeah. And so thinking about right those larger trends, especially as it relates to politics. You've been department chair, you've been the director of Kogut, you started your own podcast a few years ago called Meeting Street, which I highly recommend. How do you see sort of the humanities shifting and right now? You recently published a book called Humanities Theory, co-written by Simon During, came out in 2025. And in it, you wrote a chapter called Framing the Humanities, where you framed the humanities. So can you kind of give us an overview of the humanities right now? We'll get to how that relates specifically to politics a little bit later. But this is a tension and the kind of like nexus of your work, I feel like, is this relationship between the aesthetic and the political and between literary studies and the humanities and politics.
Right. So those are big questions. So I'll try to, approach them from a couple of different angles. I think one thing that's just worthy of note is that it's only within a fairly recent span of time that people began to talk about the general humanities.
Mm,
It used to be that scholarship was distinguished by its discipline. And so people would talk about literary criticism, art history, media studies. They still do, of course. That is still, a way of characterizing scholarship. But in the broader media sphere, meaning like, in journalism, and in terms of like work that is presented to the public describing the university, it has become quite common to talk about the humanities. And to characterize the humanities as somehow in distress or challenged or worth less at the present time than other modes of study. And that's very significant, but it's also very misleading because there's a lot going on in the humanities that is quite dynamic and vital and not really clearly understood, I think, by the general public because of this tendency rhetorically to refer to the humanities. Many people who are reading the newspaper will be constantly encountering the humanities. If they
yeah.
read a piece about climate change, they'll be reading about the human experience of climate change cultural differences in the experience of climate change, environmental injustices. All of these types of topics are part of the what we call the environmental humanities, which is a subfield in the humanities. But the very approach to the understanding of cultures and human experience is fundamental to the humanities. And this is true across a whole range of things. Most of the writing right now about AI is profoundly humanistic because it's
Yeah.
obsessed with thinking about what is the distinctiveness of the human, what is the difference between the human and the computer. Are there things that AI can't do? And does that matter? And how do we talk about that? And how do we preserve that or nourish that in various sectors of life? Now, to get to your question of what is the humanities, I mean, that can be approached in many different ways. As you know from having been a fellow over the last year, I am a pluralist. What I like to emphasize is the fact that there are many, many different ways of practicing the humanities, and you can see that in action all the time. So while one can say certain general things about what the humanities does, as I was a moment ago when I was talking about, you know, the attempt to capture elements of human experiences within the context of culture and history, it is still the case that it is very problematic to try to reduce the humanities to any specific stance or position. And that's one thing that's been going on in a lot of the conservative critique of the humanities, which is to take certain elements of certain subfields
Right.
and act as though the whole of the humanities is being, um, driven by certain value commitments in specific advocacy fields. And that is just not, at all reflective of the rich array of work that's done in the humanities, some of which is not interested in politics at all, nor does it need to be.
Right. Yeah. So we'll get back to these, but I want to note the couple like literary devices that are arising. So number one, it's that we have these synecdotic um, problems, and we have a tendency to refer when we talk about the English major as representative of the whole of the humanities, or the decline of the English major being representative for the decline of the English department. Right. So we have these synecdotic problems, and then also irony, which you are incredibly adept at spotting in like across your scholarship. So your book, Bleak Liberalism, which I have read, it's everywhere. It's like you're spotting out these ironies, but there's an irony that is relevant to also this thing of framing the humanities, which is that everywhere, as you said, that we read about anything, whether it's climate change or AI or politics, it's obsessed with the human and the human experience, but at the same time there's a devaluation of the humanities right now, and people think that it's not as relevant or not as useful. It's not a utilitarian effort to try to engage in humanistic inquiry. So those are the kind of like themes I want to tease out, but I want to get to this relationship between the aesthetic and the political, because you say in Framing the Humanities that the humanities use the aesthetic to express political commitment rather than run from it, and that theoretical arguments are not a flight from politics or critique, but rather an intensification of political insight through aesthetic means. And again, in Bleak Liberalism, you talk about how we can have aesthetic enactments of liberal thinking, which is to say aesthetic enactments of political thought. What is the relationship between the aesthetic and the political? And why does humanity's perspective offer us something that's more important, a more nuanced perspective on the political, precisely because it expresses those political commitments through aesthetic means?
Yeah, that's a great question. And first of all, I really appreciate your connecting up that moment in the humanities theory book with the project of bleak liberalism.
Yeah.
Because uh, honestly, the moment at which I make the point in humanities theory that it is again kind of misguided to critique certain theoretical positions in the humanities as overly aesthetic or what some people would say aestheticizing the political,
Right.
i.e., running away from the political, not really being political.
Right.
Um, there's a long history to that critique, uh, starting with critiques of the Frankfurt School, Theodor Adorno, and a wide range of thinkers who followed him. The idea that um, because there is such a stringent negative critique of existing forms of power, there is no place for any kind of escape or freedom except in art.
Right.
So that, there's a critique of that. And what I insist on in humanities theory, precisely at the moment that you pulled out, is that that's too reductive. Though I will confess that I have had, in the past, had very strong sympathy for that critique, um, for
Mm.
the critique of the aestheticization. But there were other reasons why I was dissatisfied with it. But in looking at a range of different, really interesting to me aspects of contemporary humanities theory, I began to see how powerful certain aesthetic renderings of certain types of political insight could be. One, you know, people in literary studies love paradox, right?
Yeah.
And one of the things you can see in a lot of the articulations of paradox is not just really being into paradox for its own sake, like the cathexis is all on that,
Right.
but rather that paradox allows one to kind of hold two things together, which, for example, um, a systemic view and a more sort of lived view.
Hmm.
So something like Rob Nixon's phrase slow violence, which is a paradox or an oxymoron, or, it has elements of that, um, allows one to kind of think about the effects of certain forms of environmental degradation and power. But to think about, well, why are they slow? They're slow because, that's partly because of the way that they impact human cultures and communities. So that it takes place over time and it's insidious in many ways. So that kind of thing I just think is incredibly interesting. And it's not simply a matter of being all excited about the fact that you got a cool, somewhat paradoxical title. Cruel optimism is another version of that, as
Yeah.
is critical fabulation. Um, so that was one thing I was interested in. I will say that at that moment in humanities theory, it's not a strong endorsing moment. I'm not saying, and therefore, this is how we should think about politics in the humanities. Again, I think there's many different ways to do it. There's ways to do it that does not particularly, hold out a certain kind of aestheticizing frisson. There's no, not necessarily any need to do that or impulse to do that. I was just sort of trying to point out the value and force of certain versions of theoretical insight that do that. So I would say, speaking more generally, the aesthetic and the political are not co-constitutive. They don't have to go together. They can illuminate one another or work through each other in specific instances. Like, for example, certain writers use literature to capture political or social conditions, to critique them or to imagine other possibilities. Um, and then other works unwittingly disclose the politics of their time in certain ways. So the humanities can provide a certain kind of insight insofar as they focus in on how political experiences or commitments are lived or how power is felt on the ground, as it were.
Yeah. The other thing I was thinking is that there's such a relationship between the aesthetic and the epistemic, especially with something like critical fabulation, um, Saidiya Hartman's work.
Yeah, yeah.
It's so like the aesthetic and the epistemic. I didn't even make that connection until now, but because to me, critical fabulation is all about problematizing epistemology, but it's also aesthetic. The use of the subjunctive to get at what we could know, might know, would know, right, should know. So there's a relationship between that as well. And then, of course, her claims are in some ways like functionally historical as well. And so that is that's really to bring all that together through the aesthetic, the medium of the aesthetic, I think is something that humanities scholarship can do particularly well. Uh,
Yeah, I mean, and
yeah,
that book had, a very powerful impact in and beyond the humanities. And
yeah,
just to clarify, for your listeners, critical fabulation was a kind of a strategy, an approach that Saidiya Hartman basically devised in order to deal with absences in the archive. So there are so many forms of experience, especially in the history of slavery, but many forms of experience that one cannot reconstruct because the archive does not hold any kind of indication of what the lived experiences of certain subjects were. And so what Saidiya Hartman advocates for is something called critical fabulation, which is to kind of speculatively imagine
Yeah.
an experience, but to hold it up to a standard of critical exactitude, as it were, right? That it be plausible, that it be powerful, that it honor what was erased. And that's fascinating and amazing. And it goes well beyond the kind of thing, again, that you'll read in sort of the public media about the humanities is very important because it helps us to tell stories. That is so watered down and so fails to capture, the incredible aesthetic um, flexibility and creativity that you see in humanities scholarship.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's like having us to tell stories, but at the same time, critical population is it's prevarication to tell a story that isn't a story that could be a story. Like it's
Right, right,
so much
right,
more complicated than that, right?
right.
Um, so let's talk about bleak liberalism because it's a page turner. I need to say that, and I really mean that. It is a page turner of literary theory, and literary readings and political theory, but it's an important book in the humanities, I feel, because in the humanities, it's often like axiomatically assumed that we don't like liberalism. There's this overwhelming kind of gestalt like force of negativity towards quote unquote liberalism. And you are a liberal. That is a label that you ascribe to. And you wrote this book, Bleak Liberalism, to talk about, again, the ironies and the paradoxes and the tensions that arise when we are speaking negatively or positively about liberalism. Liberalism in relation to neoliberalism, progressivism, radicalism, etc. And then, of course, the title, Bleak Liberalism. And so I have a lot of questions about this book, but let's start with, really like what liberalism is to you, because you talk about how you cite these critiques of liberalism that it perpetuates the very conditions it purports to wage war against, and it avoids structural amendments and does sort of more like content renovations. You say that in certain progressive or radical accounts, liberalism is not an ideology; it simply is ideology. So, to you, what is liberalism? And it's not neoliberalism. You are very clear to distinguish liberalism from neoliberalism. In a talk once, you said that neoliberalism is actually a metastasized form of economic liberalism. It's not political liberalism. And those seem like really important distinctions to me. So, what's liberalism? How do you distinguish it from these other political movements? And why bleak liberalism?
Sure, sure. And thank you for those kind words. Nobody's ever called anything I've written a page
It
turner. So
really is though. Like it's like, what's she gonna say next? Like I was feeling it, you know?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's great. That's great. So, right, as you say, I mean, I completely agree with your replication of my argument. Isn't that funny? So the basic problem, right, is that liberalism is treated as a kind of, like an ideological surround or
Right.
false consciousness, rather than a consciously held ideology. So right, it's often used thoughtlessly, I would say, in left academic work. Um, it's often used thoughtlessly, functioning as a placeholder for what we know we are against,
Right.
right? I mean, if you just sort of think about how the way it pops up when people are giving talks or in introductions to books, as though it's nothing that needs to be explained. It's just the bad guy. And what that means is a diluted ideal of universalism or individual autonomy or progress that is blind to its own exclusions and consolidations of power. So, one thing that is assumed there is that a certain kind of exclusion and power is hardwired into liberal ideology. And yet, those who are promoting it or enforcing it are utterly blind to that. So rather than saying something like liberalism has not lived up to its ideals, right?
Yeah,
Like, it is an unfinished project. It has over time tried to recognize certain forms of exclusion and address them. Rather than that, it's just said it is fundamentally always going to be exclusionary because it's going to erect a dominant subject that has to define itself against something that it excludes. Now, that kind of, that's a separate question. There's a huge political, psychological, historical, cultural question about the incredible recalcitrance of othering,
right,
and the problems that that brings and the violences associated with that. But in the case of liberalism, it's basically seen as the driver of that kind of thing.
right,
Now, as a consciously held ideology, liberalism takes different forms. So that, right, there's economic liberalism. So that, believes in the need for a free market. Um, Political liberalism is different. It holds up democracy and its institutions as critical to a healthy polity and makes no prescriptions about what people might choose. So it can result in social democracy or democratic socialism or neoliberalism, right? It's like
right.
it depends what people vote for, you know. And as we know, voting is not a clean procedure. So I mean, there are ways in which one has to be really, really alert to all the problems and challenges that afflict liberalism, which is why I advocate for a bleak liberalism, one that knows what it's up against. Um,
Right.
but fundamentally, in the case of thinking about political versus economic, political liberalism puts the procedures of democracy first and is against any extra procedural imposition of a specific form of social and economic organization. Now, neoliberalism, uh, so what does neoliberalism advocate for? Deregulation, privatization, and it promotes a kind of entrepreneurial ideal, right? And it is in that way, it's the inheritor of economic liberalism and should not be equated with liberalism tout court. Um, it's also, sort of baldly in the service of amassing of wealth and power. So
Yeah.
it doesn't really represent a vision of how the whole society might be configured. I mean, people don't go around saying, I'm a neoliberal and here's my vision for society, right? It's mostly something it's a label that's ascribed to a
Some
system.
people do. I mean, I will
Right,
say, yeah,
right,
Larry Summers, our good friend Larry, is a self-proclaimed neo-lib.
right. So it's not unheard of, but consider the source.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, but I would say in general, right?
Yeah.
It's like it seems to there, yeah, there are people who can, I think you're absolutely right. They can adapt economic liberalism to say this is the best way to approach the possibilities for growth and flourishing. But it seems to me to really sort of lack a kind of rich and textured sense of the good. Um, Now, what's really interesting too is that some of the most interesting critics of neoliberalism, such as David Harvey and Wendy Brown, whom I discuss in Bleak Liberal, sorry, whom I discuss in Bleak Liberalism, emphasize the way in which it eviscerates traditional liberal ideas. So that's really interesting to me because they're sort of because they're such excellent scholars and theorists, they are forthright about the ideals that are being undercut, and they recognize that they're actually liberal ideals. Um, so yeah, was there another question built in there that you
Well,
wanted me
I
to address?
wanted distinguish liberalism from progressivism because you do talk about was either in Bleak Liberalism or a talk that you gave about Bleak Liberalism, but you are against sort of just saying, oh, let's call it progressivism or let's be progressive, let's be radicals, right? And you talk about quote unquote bleak radicalism actually in Bleak Liberalism, and you say that there's a that liberalism and bleak radicalism resonate so much in their disposition towards their objects of study. Um, you mentioned Lakoff at one point, actually, George Lakoff, and how he says, let's just call it progressivism. And as someone that is familiar with linguistics and the linguistics community, he's not our favorite guy, but he holds a lot of power. And so, you know, because I think that like that would be the question that I would ask, because it's like, sure, there are critiques of liberalism, and sure, liberalism is better than all its alternatives, but why not renovate liberalism itself, do a liberal critique of liberalism, and just say progressivism?
Right. So that's a good question. In the case of Lakoff, what he's registering is actually another dimension of the critique of liberalism that we have not discussed, which is the political partisan
Right.
framing of liberalism. And the liberal is just somebody who is, for progressive social ideals and change and is woke, let's just
Right.
say, right? Like
Right.
woke is the new like liberal. um, that's a sort of different problem. And I think Lakoff is trying to say, look, rather than avowing liberalism and just playing into a really entrenched, um, sort of situation where that's a damning label and it's used by politicians in partisan manner, let's kind of shift it, use a different word so that we kind of disable that tendency.
Right.
Um, okay, so that's where I think things are coming from in the case of Lakoff. Progressivism, I mean, again, I guess what I would say there is that liberalism, political liberalism, is more procedurally stringent than progressivism.
Yeah.
Now, this is a sort of broad claim to make, but progressivism has built into its name, a kind of a set of sort of assumptions that are sort of, they're kind of unnamed, but people sort of, agree on them because the term progressivism has been applied to them
Right.
over the course of history, like labor movements, et cetera. Um, and for that reason, because I think it presupposes a specific political content, this is a reason why I prefer advocating for liberalism. Personally, you know, I, I'm a social democrat, you know, personally, I believe in a mixed economy. I believe in regulation. I believe, et cetera.
Right.
But when it comes down to the sort of base foundation political commitment or view or belief, I'm a liberal in the sense that I think that I privilege procedure, which is to say, voting,
Mm.
process, the rule of law, et cetera. I mean,
Yeah.
all of these things are hard, like these distinctions, they're not foolproof and they're difficult to hold fast in every instance. And people can, it's possible to show that, procedures can be corrupt, et cetera. But that's the distinction I would make.
Okay. And then, because bleak liberalism is sort of a literary text, what does it afford us that we have a literary engagement with liberal thought? Why a literary engagement with liberal thought? You are doing all these readings in this book of 19th century novels, 20th century novels, thinking about how literature has grappled with liberal arguments, and highlighting that as another irony that in the humanities we don't like liberalism, and yet our novels are profoundly engaged with liberal thought. So why that kind of literary engagement? And I suppose that relates again back to the first question about the aesthetic and the political, but it's not necessarily just the aesthetic in these novels. It's I mean, you dialogic and structural. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, right. I think that I would precisely say that literary engagements with liberal thought help us to see the complexity of liberalism as it is lived and reflected upon, right?
Yeah.
And theorized. So it's not just a sort of thoughtless enactment of reigning ideology. It's not just sort of, in the service of forwarding a kind of bourgeois ideological conception of the individual making their way in society. Um, and so I look to see whether there are certain aesthetic elements that don't have to do with, the kind of classic Bildungsroman, right? The journey of the individual hero or heroine, but also to kind of, pull out certain aesthetic elements that are expressive of liberal ideas. So, most generally, it's trying to capture or think about the ways in which consciously held ideology is represented, and that you see most powerfully in political novels, um, but you see it elsewhere as well. And then the importance of ideas-driven dialogue in the novel of ideas and the political novel. So, which is to say, what's going on there? How do we understand those really interesting dialogues in, say, Hard Times or Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South? How do we think about the ways in which people from different classes or different ideological positions suddenly are arguing within the novel? And is that the same as regular dialogue? It's actually not. So I call it character-character argument, and I draw on the work of the narratologist James Phelan, who talks about the ways in which dialogue, he isn't really talking about politics, but he talks about the way in which certain dialogues in novels function as a kind of a form of um, narrative in a mediated form. In other words, you're being presented with a, a set of ideas that are in conflict. And you're not only reading a dialogue that's part of the action of the story. You're being asked to kind of reflect upon and think about ideas about politics, but not in a monologic way. And I think that's fascinating, and I think it's fundamentally liberal. And then the last thing I would say is that I'm really interested in the tension between what you could call the systemic and the lived perspectives in realism, and how they reflect a tension between the systemic and the lived perspective in liberalism. And my central example and the title of my book is playing on that is Charles Dickens's Bleak House, which has a third person narration and a first person narration, which are alternated throughout the book. And the third person narration is like stringently expressive of and attentive to and focused on systemic power, oppressive power. And then the first person narrator, Esther, is sort of morally aspirational. And it's just a fascinating juxtaposition. And I think that it's expressive of something that you see across the history of liberal thought.
Yeah. So I want to go to pluralism because it seems like that is kind of like what we keep on coming back to, whether it is character, what do you call it? Character argument,
Mhm.
that being fundamentally liberal, right? And then the multiplicity of voices. And this is something that you return to in Framing the Humanities and also in other essays, one called, Situating the Method debates, thinking about how you argue that liberalism or that pluralism is actually intrinsic to humanities pedagogy and liberalism because that's what we do in the humanities classroom. We have different voices offering different perspectives, but at the same time, liberalism is maligned by humanities scholarship because, we don't want to teach you a multiplicity of things. It's just like one viewpoint. We're sort of seen as this like normative education. Um, there's also this thing that you call bland liberalism, which you talk about in Framing the Humanities. You say that bland liberalism is this multiplicity of voices rather than a critical and contested sphere of reflective endorsement and engaged debate. And I'm not actually sure always whether you're ventriloquizing those critiques or not, because what is bland liberalism and how could we get to true liberalism? Because right. There's so much debate, it seems to me. And again, it is ironic that there's so much debate about what the humanities should be, like what we should teach, what we actually do teach. It's not even just a question of like of deontology or normative questions. It's like, what is it that we teach? Do we teach skills or do we teach moral and self-cultivation? Is this historical teleological or moral anthropological? And then why study the humanities? Um, but I want to kind of bring that together through the lens of pluralism because that is a value of yours, it seems.
Right. So Yeah, there's a lot there. I'm going to just start by trying to make some distinctions.
Yeah.
So, the first thing I want to say is that individual humanities scholars and students often, typically, have value commitments that they have developed over time. And they bring those value commitments to their work, I'm going to say. And the reason I say to their work in the case of scholars is that I think it's extremely important to be, how shall we say this? To aspire to create a pluralistic culture in the classroom. But that does not mean that one has to, uh, in any way, suppress or, continually flaunt one's open-mindedness in one's own work, which may be very committed to driving a specific argument that is linked to a worldview and a set of values. So I just want to make that really clear that I think this notion of like, what Max Weber called value neutrality, I mean, this notion of a sort of being very careful about not trying to impose something when you are in the classroom, or I would say when you represent an academic unit.
Yeah.
And I think that's true even in the case of what we can call the advocacy subfield. So, I have been directing a humanities institute. To me, it's incredibly important that this institute not be associated with a particular agenda, a specific agenda, a substantive political agenda.
Right.
Super important to me. And I try to make this kind of a big tent, right? But there are people within the tent who very strongly advocate for certain frameworks of analysis, right? And that seems to me all to the good. But even within something which might seem like there's a lot of agreement about, I don't know, certain kind of concepts of analysis, um, let's just say in the certain versions of the environmental humanities, it might be very common to talk about extractivism, racial
Right.
capitalism, um, et cetera. That doesn't mean everyone working on the environmental humanities, thinks that that is a kind of master key that needs to be invoked and re-invoked in order to understand the kind of crisis of the environment. So, to me, it's just really, really important to consistently draw attention to and try to help to foster and recognize and be open to that pluralism. At the same time, people have very strongly held views, and or sometimes they're trying to figure something out and they're not strongly held. They're being tested and explored, and I think there has to just be space for all of that. And so that's just sort of like that's just an answer to the question of pluralism. There was a lot more that was packed into your question. You invoked the notion of like, what should we be doing? Or the fact that there's a lot of discourse around this notion of what we should do or what we ideally do,
Or what we fundamentally actually do,
or what
right?
we
Yeah.
fundamentally actually do. And um, in that kind of discourse around the general humanities, one often sees either an emphasis on critical thinking, something like a methods or skills-based justification for what we do, or even
Right.
just description of what we do
Yeah.
and its importance on the one hand. And then on the other hand, um, forms of description that focus on this idea of moral cultivation,
Right.
right? That the humanities somehow teach you certain very important moral values, or how to cultivate values. And I think, first of all, I think that, you know, I would not elevate one over the other. And I have a specific way of approaching the latter, which is the question of the cultivation of value. So the problem with the critical thinking approach is that it is simply not something that the humanities has a monopoly on. Critical thinking takes place in every single discipline. And I think it's really misguided to claim that the humanities has some sort of special, purchase on that.
Right.
I think there's a lot of critical thinking in the humanities, but I don't think that it can say that, we're providing this service and no one else is.
Right.
Um, on the matter of like, this question of like Bildung or, the formation of the moral self, et cetera, or, the learning of civics. So my problem with that is that often, not uniformly, but often it sounds like, going to a humanities classroom is like going to church.
Right.
And I find that just like, um, really, really misguided. And so, my approach is that, and I've argued this in several places, uh, probably most extensively in my book, Psyche and Ethos, the last chapter of that book, but at various different places, and I make reference to it in humanities theory. Um, what I emphasize is the opportunity that the humanities presents for the clarification of value. What does that mean? But it's like it is absolutely distinct from the imparting of value. It doesn't, the humanities don't directly impart value. They ideally they don't, right? And this is what the conservative right is claiming that we're doing. And maybe some people are doing it. I do think there are some environments where it can feel that way, right? That there's something we all believe and we're here in the classroom to learn it. But I would say far more frequently, what's going on is something called the clarification of value. So let's just give it like, and let me give a really basic example. Every author has a worldview, right? It might be confused, but they have a worldview. And one tries to analyze or describe what that is, and then discuss its informing values, not with a view to simply affirming them, like saying, oh, and here's how we can learn to be good, but to clarifying them. What are these values? And then, anyone can use that to take what they want from it. I mean, and critics have worldviews too. And you can teach criticism in a similar way. And that's not to say that, one can make an absolutely clean uh, or create a clean barrier between this kind of right, we're only clarifying values here in
Right.
the classroom. And then when I go write an article, I'm like totally polemical about something or other. But rather that, that is fundamentally, I mean, what I think humanities scholars are doing because they're constantly learning, they're constantly rethinking, and they're kind of sharing that way of life with their students.
Yeah. I mean, having been, right, a part of this institute, the Kogan Institute, and seeing all these different humanities scholars from, you know, political science, philosophy, ethnic studies, history, anthropology, English, right? It's just so clear to me that we have very different skill sets and very different worldviews. Like it is just, I actually think that English in particular gives you really important skills, close reading among them. But
Yes,
but that's
yes.
not the same skill that like a historian isn't necessarily taught close reading. And so it seems to me actually very dangerous to homogenize, as you said at the beginning, right, the humanities because they're very different skills and very different understandings of history, materiality, ideology, subjectivity, like very different understandings of these things. Um, so that seems important. And
Right. And once you add intellectual temperament,
mhm,
or individual idiosyncrasy into the mix, you have an amazing kind of plurality of forms of understanding human experience.
right. And thinking about like the English department as the kind of synecdoche for the humanities and thinking about all these questions of like the method wars and what should we teach and why should we teach them? I mean, I want your perspective on this because it seems um, important now to clarify uh, how we read and why we read and what we read um, within the discipline, the field of literary studies, there's a lot of debate over like the materials that we should read from which time periods, from which authors. At Brown, of course, we're famous for our strong humanities. Or it's not strong. Sorry, it's not strong. At Brown, we're famous for having a theoretical component to literary studies, right? There are a lot of theorists here, and I consider myself a theorist, and that is what I would like to read. But you read novels and write about them and criticize them, and it's not all theory. There are also novels in there. So thinking about, and also, if you want to touch on AI, of course you can, but you don't have to. But this seems to me important in the age of AI for all kinds of reasons. I see theory as being incredibly important uh, right now.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. Um, and I'd love to hear you say actually a little more about why you think theory is important in the age of AI. Um, I mean, if I'm thinking about your question from the perspective of AI, I would have a slightly different answer than the question about just, what have the method debates yielded? I
Right.
tend to think of the method debates as a subfield themselves. And I say that because while I think they've been quite generative in certain ways, I think they are sort of their own, in some ways it's a kind of insular argument that gets massive citation numbers,
Hmm.
but
Right.
I'm not entirely sure, how much it has actually affected the practice of scholarship, though I do think the kind of fundamental um, turn advocated for by certain scholars from sort of more suspicious reading to more kind of open, affiliative reading has had an effect on many scholars, many early career scholars. The question of AI is really interesting. Um, I mean, it's sort of astonishing how fast it's moving, and how already impressive it is. So, one thing I think is that it's a losing battle to try to just, either ignore it or set it aside or imagine that one can create an environment that is absolutely free of its effects. Um, but I do think it's really important, and this came up a little bit earlier when we were talking about AI and the question of the human and what AI can do and what AI can't do. Um, I think it's absolutely important to pay careful attention to the way in which the progress of scholarship is driven by relationships that develop between students and teachers and between one generation and another. Um, I'm not a huge fan of the word mentor, in part because I think a lot of scholarship is driven by agon, by disagreement. Um, and it just feels, yeah, a little bit paternalistic to me. But but having exemplars in your midst, even
Yeah.
exemplars you disagree with or depart from in some key way, but who otherwise, kind of motivated you, that has been critical to the life of scholarship and research. I mean, there's intellectual sociological work on this. Randall Collins comes to mind. This interview with me is a perfect example of this dynamic and its importance.
Yeah.
Um, Now, it's great that there are many newer ways to access the work of scholars, like YouTube, podcasts like this one, but the IRL experiences are critical to practices of deep thinking and study and dialogue that make the life of the mind meaningful and that keep intellectual attachments and resistances vital. Because psychologically and sociologically speaking, those relations are critical to the advancement of knowledge. And one thing I'm really, uh, interested to see and to watch is how this generational question is impacted by AI, because there's already been to a certain degree, not really so much at places like Brown yet, but there's been a kind of um, uh, a breaking down, let's say, of what had been seen as these kind of indissolubly linked elements. And by that, I mean the semester, the class, the single professor,
Right.
right? If this becomes a gig economy, um, and people are just grabbing from Academy from Khan Academy, or um, just listening to famous academics at 2 times speed on a podcast, which they might be doing right now, is there's just a real that's important because it provides access to people who might not otherwise have access.
Yeah.
And I think that's hugely important. And I really applaud what you're doing with your podcast. But at the same time, what AI cannot replicate is this really powerful experience of kind of generational transmission, intellectual. And by generational, I mean like, not necessarily the exact time of a human generation, like half generations, 10 years, whatever. Things are happening in different cohorts and groups and over time that are really important and I think are really enabled by the kind of in-presence experience.
Right. Yeah. That is an interesting perspective on that. I've never heard that defense before of a generational generational dialogue, generational or like those kinds of I guess you're talking about the kind of like productive friction of people
Yes.
coming together in disagreement and from different generations and age groups. Um, in terms of you asked like why, I think theory is important.
Yeah.
I think that it's about um, thinking about what it is to read and juxtaposing different reading practices and seeing how they garner and engender different results. A feminist reading versus a psychoanalytic reading, a paranoid reading, reparative reading. These are very different reading practices, and they will yield very different opinions on a text. And then, of course, there's the whole thing of problematizing and expanding the definition of a text. And I think that that's something that theory gives us in particular is seeing the world as literary, seeing the like, Derrida tells us, right, there's nothing outside the text. And to me, I take that as not just that there's nothing that isn't semiotic, but that the world itself is literary and kind of lends itself to literary interpretation and analysis. And I think that um, giving people the skills and showing them that they can use those skills to analyze things that are not just Austen, Eliot, Trollope, whatever, that's really, really important. Uh, it always seems it's funny to me. I feel like there's so much like people are on the defensive, right? Because they love Shakespeare or they love Chaucer or whatever, and I it's like I don't really understand why it is this shocking insult to say, well, maybe Shakespeare isn't so relevant to my generation, but people get very defensive if you say that. But I think that I don't know. I guess like I'm less sure that there's a specific author that we need to study, right? I don't know about the content that we need to study, but I think that there are skills and methods that we need to teach, and I just. I know that there are so many debates whether it's okay to teach movies or whatever in English classrooms, and I sort of say why not? Because also, if you think about the vastness of books, it's not as if like we're allowing like contemporary literature into all our classrooms, but not movies or something. Like it seems to me like there's a canon that we teach from, and the places where I have been taught real contemporary scholarship have been theory classrooms, reading contemporary theory, because there has been like so many advancements, even in the past 20 years, in Black literary theory, Black studies, Afro-pessimism, right? In eco-criticism, queer theory. Like these things are really advancing, and they're advancing because of the world and culture is advancing. So I just think cultural studies is really important because it comments on the culture that we're living in. Um, there's I guess like there's that Jeffrey Nealon article or book, and then of course Anna Kornbluh's immediacy or the style of two-leg capitalism. Where they're both talking about different. They are disagree on the reasons why, but they both agree that the English classroom is now becoming like a therapy, like biopolitical kind of like you learn about yourself and not about the text. And I would say that that is a concern of mine. Like I don't think that we would want humanities classrooms or English classrooms to be the place where you learn about yourself, write about yourself, see yourself reflected in everything. It doesn't have to all be about identification, but I see theory as getting us actually away from that paradigm because the practice of reading a book often especially with my generation, is like, oh, how do I see myself reflected in this book, in this character? And if I can't see myself reflected in the character, then either I can't understand it, I don't, or I can't understand it, I'm not equipped to really identify, or I shouldn't identify because maybe this character doesn't have the identity that I have or the experiences that I've had. And I see theory as getting us away from having to essentialize identity all the time um, in our scholarship.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful. I completely am in sympathy with everything that you said. And one thing that's kind of interesting is that uh, theory, I mean, your description of the kind of uh, the important kind of corrective effect of theory on something that could become more sort of therapeutic or
Right.
self-involved is that, another way to look at that is that theory invites this kind of thinking of the relation between the systemic and the lived. And when I was talking about that in relation to sort of bleak liberalism, that dialectic or that tension
Yeah.
between the systemic and the lived is not, you know, only to be found in liberalism. I mean, any social philosophy has some version of it. And typically, any theory that is trying to make sense of any aspect of, the cultural sphere also has that, even if it's a little bit cryptic, right? So I think that that's really important because it does help to sort of prompt a kind of detached viewpoint. And yet at the same time, not completely detached, right? So that to kind of work between, not necessarily your some sort of like very narrow conception of, identity
Right.
and the system, but rather just experience and the
Mm.
system. So I think that's really important. And I also agree with you that like there is no need to preserve certain canons. I don't see any, especially if it's done in a kind of you know, anxious and defended way. That just
Yeah.
seems crazy, right? What you want to do, and this really is interestingly an argument, for method, right? In a way, and skills, as you kind of made clear. But the thing that I would say is that the skills involved in close reading and understanding complex theory are also always going to be in the service of this notion of value clarification that I was talking about.
Yeah, that is so. Well, that to me, that's like a strong argument because Jonathan Kramnick's book Criticism and Truth would say something not opposite but different, which is that the skills of close reading are critical to truth seeking, right?
Right.
Not necessarily value clarification, but truth. So I love it that you're engaged in the method wars, I guess, is another way of
Yeah.
saying that. Yeah. Um, so so you're coming to this kind of transition period, right? You're stepping down as the director of Koget, which is devastating. But I mean, it's been an exciting year, I guess, at Brown. There's been a lot of parties and celebrations for Amanda Anderson that I've gotten to attend, which is exciting. But you're also about to come out with another book, another one of many, and it's on rumination. And I was wondering if you could speak about just this transition period that's coming up. What are you working on next? And
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. So, right, I just I'm working on the sort of the final revisions for a book on rumination um, as a sort of a philosophical, psychological, ethical concept, and the role that literature has played in representing it from the 18th century to the to the
yeah.
present, focusing on the English canon. Um, so rumination, right? It's a very different topic for me. It does come out of a book I wrote called Psyche and Ethos, which was about the tension between psychological explanation and moral understanding in the modern era, from Freud, through cognitive science with literary examples. So I became really interested at a certain point in really just how we are saturated in therapeutic discourse in our culture, right?
Yeah.
And particularly became sort of interested in the ways in which um, psychological ways of talking about actions and people and conditions were often displacing forms of moral judgment. I give you an example, like to call somebody a narcissist,
Mm.
which is, not a nice thing to call someone, but it's still sort of, it's a kind of psychological label rather than to, call somebody a villain, right?
Right.
And I was fascinated by this sort of tension in a lot of areas of cultural life. And while I was working on that, in particular, while I was working on uh, Henry James, I started to think about this concept of rumination, which is a sort of a form of thinking that takes place over time and is recursive and is in response to a moral shock or disturbance. And to think about it as a really significant and important form of moral processing that has not really been captured, uh, I would say, yeah, has not been captured in moral philosophy, in moral psychology, in literary studies. It's really just a nonce descriptive term that you see, in certain literary texts, philosophical texts. The one place where it has strong purchase is in psychology and psychiatry, where it is used as a descriptor and is, seen as something that needs to stop, right? That it's a negative thought loop, often focused on some sort of ego wound. It's non-productive. You need to let go. You're stuck. You need to move on. So that's where I first, that was also part of where I kind of came to understand that there was something really interesting about this concept. I mean, my first reaction to seeing it used in psychological context was just, you've stolen a beautiful word, like call it something
Yeah.
else. But then I came to really, really question, whether it was accurate, an accurate way of talking about certain forms of rumination. I think there are non-productive forms, but I think that there are profoundly uh, deep and powerful forms that take place over time and that should not be pathologized or people should not be medicated out of. So
Yeah.
anyway, that's the topic. I'm finishing up with that. And I think next, I mean, I'm very interested right now, probably understandably, in political psychology
Yeah.
and our crazy world. So I don't really have anything to say besides that, but I think because I've been so interested in psychology and in thinking outside of the Freud Lacan nexus, which was really dominant when I was in graduate school. So frankly, I just kind of ignored it. I mean, I,
Right.
I, I was responsible and learned about it, but it didn't inform my work.
Right.
But, later I became aware of like all the other interesting psychological frameworks, and particularly the British objects relations theorists. And that kind of opened
Yep.
up a whole new world. Um, so I'm just really, yeah, I want to think more about the relation between politics and psychology, which it was at play to some degree in the rumination book, because one of the prompts to rumination is when your dignity is assaulted. And that
Yeah.
can be within the context of really oppressive conditions of differentiating among people's value and worth.